Hi, welcome to another calculations training class. If it's your first time here, my name's Azza. I'm a pharmacist and independent prescriber who's also been a pre-registration training tutor for the last 22 years. I've started this online training to try and get a bit more awareness out there to students that calculations is not as hard as it actually seems. It's just about understanding the principles that are involved and then applying that to scenarios that are given to you in the exam. So today I wanted to do a short video just about conversion dosing of levodopa dosages to rotigotine patches. Now, what I've done is I've put together 6 different past paper questions that I've come across, and I'm just going to show you my technique that I tend to use when I'm training my students to how to tackle these questions. In the exam, you'll be given a resource pack if you get a question like this, to the one to your left hopefully. It's taken off the Parkinson's website for emergency treatment. And what the resource pack tells you is how to convert a dose of levodopa to find an equivalent dose of the rotigotine patches. There's also involved in the resource pack some vital information that you must be aware of. For example, when you've done your calculation, it talks about that you need to round it to the nearest 2 milligram. It also talks about the fact that the dose that you calculate is only for a 24-hour window. So if in the exam you're given a different frequency, the question asks for the amount of rotigotine the patient would need for 48 hours, 72 hours, a week, you must obviously then multiply your calculation to the correct frequency that they want. Another thing to be aware of is that the rotigotine patches currently only come in a 2 milligram, 4 milligram, 6 milligram and 8 milligram. So if the question asks you how many of the 8 milligram patches, for example, you would need for a 24-hour treatment, when you've got your answer, you must obviously at the end divide it so that you can give full patches of 8 milligram. There's also a scenario where it talks about the fact that when you've calculated in the third stage, which I'll talk about in a few moments, different stages of the process, the levodopa equivalent daily dose, the total amount, if it exceeds 350 milligrams, then you must obviously only use 16 milligrams of the rotigotine dose. The maximum dose that can currently be prescribed to a patient of rotigotine is 16 milligrams for Parkinson's treatment. So if you've got a calculation of a dose and it's greater than 16 milligrams of rotigotine needed in 24 hours, just be aware that you must round it down always to 16 milligram. Now what I'm going to briefly do is just talk to you about the methodology I'm going to use in these calculations. So I'll be using a 4-stage process, and what that 4-stage process is, I'll just go through with you. It's labelled A, B, C and D, and what that involves is stage A involves calculating the total daily dose of levodopa that the patient's taking. Stage 2, which is B, involves calculating the total daily dose of the dopamine agonist that the patient's going to be taking. Stage C will involve me adding what I calculated in A to B and then multiplying that by 0.55. Stage D, which is the 4th stage in the process, will involve me taking the answer from stage C and dividing it by 20 to get my answer of milligrams of rotigotine that the patient will need for a 24-hour window. Now, I know that might look a little bit much right now, but once you start watching some of the videos in this calculations video I've put together, hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense for you. So without further ado, let's dive in. The answer to this question is 8 milligrams. So it's the 8 milligram patch that the patient's going to require. More important than the answer, let's take a look at the methodology around how you should be tackling these questions, or how best I think to tackle these questions. So the way I tend to teach my pre-regs is when we have a calculation question like this where we're converting from a Parkinson's patient from levodopa over to a patch formulation, we use the 4-stage technique A, B, C, D. So if you look on the left here, you've got the resource pack, and the resource pack talks about doing various calculations. These calculations encompass these 4 stages. So we've got A, B, C, D. So we list this down first of all straight away before we start. So we've got our levodopa calculation, we've got our dopamine calculation. In stage C, we're going to add A and B together, and we're going to multiply that answer by 0.55. And in stage D, we're going to take our answer from stage C and we're going to divide it by 20 to get the Rotigotine patch strength that we require. So that's how we memorize our formula for tackling this type of calculation question. Obviously you've got the resource pack, you could just quite simply work through each stage of the resource pack as well. But however, this is just a methodology that we use and we learn to save time and be comfortable with this in the exam. So stage 1 levodopa calculation, what does that involve? That involves calculating the total levodopa daily dose. So if you look at the question up here, it mentions that the patient's taking 50 milligrams 4 times a day of the standard release preparation of levodopa content, and they're taking 100 milligrams of the controlled release once at night. So for total amount of levodopa, it's going to be 50 milligrams times 4, because it's 50 milligrams 4 times a day. That's the levodopa content we're looking at, and we're going to add to that the 100 milligrams of levodopa in the controlled release preparation, and we're going to multiply that. If you look over on your left here in the first box, you need to be aware that for the MR preparation you multiply it by 0.7. So we're going to multiply that by 0.7 to get our answer. Now, looking at this box over here, if the patient was on, for example, a COMT inhibitor like entacapone or something like that, we would have to multiply by 1.3. However, if they're on an MR preparation and a COMT inhibitor, then we would use this value to multiply it by 0.91. So in this situation here, all we're going to do is we're going to multiply the prolonged release preparation amount of levodopa by 0.7. So if you put this in on your calculator, 50 milligrams times 4 is 200 milligrams. So you're going to do 200 plus 100 times 0.7. That gives you an answer of 270 milligrams. So that's our levodopa total daily calculation. Remember that. Now we're going to do our dopamine step over here. So dopamine is where we look and say, is the patient taking any dopamine agonist? And they aren't. They're not on one at all in this scenario. So this is pretty straightforward. The answer is going to be 0. Now we're going to come to stage 3 of our process, part C. And in part C we add our answer from A and B together. So we're going to do 270 plus 0, and we're going to times this by 0.55. And if you do that on your calculator, you get 148.5 milligrams. Now we come to stage C, where we're going to divide it by 20 to get the Rotigotine patch strength. One thing I want to mention to you, that in stage C, when we did this calculation, the answer that we got here is the total levodopa dose, equivalent dose. So that's the total amount of levodopa that the patient's taking. So when we do stage D, we take our answer from stage C, which is 148.5, and we divide it by 20. If you do that on your calculator, you get an answer of 7.425 milligrams. Now, in your resource pack, I'm just going to scroll across here just to show you, in your resource pack now, it mentions that you want to round your answer to the nearest 2 milligrams. So let me just talk to you a little bit about rounding quickly to the nearest 2 milligrams. If we've got 7.425 milligrams, first of all, what are the numbers that are to the nearest 2 milligram? You've got 8 milligrams and you've got 6 milligrams. So what you do is you actually take the 7.4 part there and you say, what's the middle between 6 and 8? It's 7. So you say, where does 7.4 fall? So 7.4 falls closer to the 8 milligram. It falls between here. Can you see this line here? Between the 7 and the 8. Therefore, we round it up to 8 milligrams. So the answer is 8 milligrams in this scenario. Now, the other thing you need to be aware of is in the resource pack it mentions over here on your left that the patches come in a 2 milligram, a 4 milligram, a 6 milligram and an 8 milligram. Patients can use more than one patch at a time, so be aware of that. But you also need to be aware of this important fact, that when you get your answer, the maximum amount of rotigotine that the patient can take in 24 hours is 16 milligrams. So if your answer is greater than 16, it must be brought down to 16 milligrams. That's very important, folks. Now, when we look at some other questions in this workbook, we may come across larger amounts of rotigotine. The answer to this question is 2. So the patient would require 2 rotigotine 8 milligram patches per 24-hour period. So let's take a look at the methodology that we use to get to this answer. So again, we start off by writing out our 4-stage process. So we've got A, B, C and D. And A is my levodopa total daily calculation, B is my dopamine agonist daily calculation, part C is where I'm going to add A and B together and I'm going to multiply it by 0.55. That'll give me my answer of milligrams of total equivalent levodopa daily dose, because I'm taking into account the risk of side effects. And then part D is where I'm going to take my answer from C and I'm going to divide it by 20 to get the number of milligrams of rotigotine in patches that they're going to need per 24 hours. So now that I've done that, I can now jump into my calculation. So for levodopa, looking at the question up here, it's telling us they're taking 2 tablets of the levodopa, of 100 milligrams levodopa, 3 times a day. So if they're taking 2 tablets, so it'd be 2 times 100 milligrams times 3 times a day. So if you put 2 times 100 is 200 milligrams, so 2 times 100 is 200 milligrams, times my 3 gives me 600 milligrams a day that the patient's taking. So 600 milligrams, that's the total daily dose of levodopa. Now if you look at the dopamine agonist, well, the questions told us that they're only taking that. They've not talked about ropinirole or carbergoline or any other dopamine agonists. So here the answer is going to be 0. So part C of the calculation, we add A and B together. So we're going to add our 600 milligrams to our 0, which was our answer in B, and then we're going to multiply it by 0.55. If you do that on your calculator, you get an answer of 330 milligrams. Now, in part C, we take our, part D, over here, we take our answer from C. So we take 330 milligrams and we divide it by 20 to get our number of milligrams that the patient needs per day, which is 16.5 milligrams. Now, looking at the resource pack, it tells us that Once we've calculated our number of milligrams dosage that the patient needs for the rotigotine patch on the left here, it says round it to the nearest 2 milligrams. And the maximum that the patient can take is 16 milligrams. So if we start by rounding to the nearest 2 milligrams, let's take a look. 16.5 milligrams. To round this to the nearest 2 milligrams, you need to say to yourself, well, what are the nearest 2 milligrams to 16? Well, straight away the nearest 2 milligrams are 18 and 16. So 16.5 falls between there. So what I tend to do is I then say, okay, what's the midpoint between 18 and 16? It's 17. So if 17 is my midpoint between 16 and 18, where does 16.5 fall? It falls on this side of the barrier between my 16 and 17. That's where my 16.5 falls. Therefore, I'm going to round it to 16. If it was 17.5 or 17.3, any number above 17, I would have had to round it up to the 18. So that's the trick when you're rounding to the nearest 2. So in this scenario, our answer is 16 milligrams. However, in the resource pack, it mentions here that the patches are only available as 2 milligram, 4 milligram, 6 milligram, and 8 milligram. So therefore, the patient would require 2 of the 8 milligram patches, which is our answer. So your key learning point here, hopefully, is that you can obviously just use the resource pack to do the calculation, but the whole point of this video is for me to show you the method which I tend to use and I teach students to use, which is the 4-stage ABCD method. The answer to this question is 48 milligrams. So let's take a look at, first of all, the question this time. So again, once you're reading through the exam question, what you want to do is the last statement of the question down here. You want to really be reading that statement twice. So you really want to get a good understanding and breaking down what it is that the question actually wants from you. So for example, the question's actually wanting the total strength of rotigotine in milligrams over 72 hours. Okay? I can't stress that enough, that in GPHC calculations, a lot of the common mistakes that are made in calculations are due to the fact that students don't actually spend a few seconds before they submit their answer double checking the last statement in the question, i.e. the number of decimal places that the answer should be to, the units that the answer should be in, or for example the length of time that they're asking it over. So in this question here, they want the answer over 72 hours, and you must be aware that rotigotine, when you do this calculation, it gives you the answer over 24 hours. So it actually, the calculation gives you over 24. So you're going to have to times your answer at the end by 3 to get it over 72 hours. So just remember to read the last statement in the question again before you submit your answer, which is one of the key things that I talk about a lot of the time in my masterclasses when we're teaching students. So let's take a look at the methodology now of how to tackle this question. So again, what we do is we follow our 4-stage process. So we've got A, B, C and D. And A is where we're going to do our Levodopa calculation for the total levodopa daily dose. B is where we're going to do our dopamine agonist calculation for the total amount of daily dose. In part C, we're going to add A and B together and we're going to times it by 0.55. And in stage D, what we're going to do is we're going to take our answer from C and we're going to divide it by 20 to get the number of milligrams of rotigotine, which is the answer in 24 hours. I'll write that down actually just so that you can actually see it. So milligrams, and I'll put /24 hours for you. Okay, so let's start off with, first of all, with our levodopa calculation. So looking above over here in the question, it tells us that the patient's taking 1 tablet a day of 250 milligram content levodopa, and that's a standard release preparation. It then tells us that they're taking 200 milligrams of levodopa in an MR modified release formulation once at night. So if you looked in the resource pack to your left, it talks about the fact that if the patient is taking a modified release preparation, when you calculate the amount of levodopa, you must times it by 0.7. If they're on a COMT inhibitor like entacapone or something like that, you're going to have to multiply it by 1.3. If they're on a modified release preparation and they're on a COMT inhibitor, at that point you're going to times it by 0.91. So what we're going to do here in this scenario is we're actually going to take our 250 milligram dose up here and start with that. So we're going to write down for our levodopa, we've got 250 milligrams plus 200 milligrams of the modified release version, so 200 milligrams multiplied by 0.7. Now make sure you understand this, that when you've got your levodopa, if it's a modified release preparation, look to your resource pack and use that value out of the resource pack. So it's this value here, 0.7. The patient's not on a COMT inhibitor, so we're not going to use any of those other values. We're just going to use the 0.7. Now if you put this in on your calculator, 200 milligram times 0.7, and add 250 to it, you get an answer of 390 milligrams, and that's the total daily dose of levodopa for A. Also be aware of this part where it's 1 a day. So if they gave you a dose of twice a day or 3 times a day or 4 times a day for the standard release preparation, you would have to multiply that by the number of times a day they're taking it. So now let's move on to our dopamine calculation. So the dopamine agonist is carbergoline over here, and it comes as a 2 milligram preparation. So what we do is we say 2 milligrams multiplied by, and if you look in the box over here, it tells you that you need to multiply it by 100. So it's a number of milligrams, the total amount of dopamine to take in a day in milligrams, times by 100 to give us our equivalent amount to levodopa. So 2 milligrams times 100, and that's 200 milligrams. Now that we've done step A and B, we can now move on to C, where we add A and B together. So we're going to do 390 on our calculator plus our 200 times by 0.55, and that takes into account side effects to reduce them. So if we do that on our calculator, you get an answer of 324.50. That's your total amount of levodopa that the patient's going to be taking. So in the last stage of the process, we do stage D, which is where we take our answer from C and we divide it by 20 to get the amount of milligrams of rotigotine equivalent patches that they're going to need for 24 hours. So in order to do that, what you're going to do is you're going to take this answer here, 324.50, and you're going to divide it by 20 on your calculator, and that's going to give you an answer of 16.225. Now we need to round that to the nearest 2 milligrams, just like we did in the previous questions. And if you look in the resource pack, that's what it wants you to do. It tells you here, round it to the nearest 2 milligrams. So 16.225 rounded to the nearest 2 milligrams is 16 milligrams. And if you're not sure how to round to the nearest 2 milligrams, just look at the first 2 questions we did in this video, and I talked about that in there. Now it's 16 milligrams in 24 hours, and the question asks us over 72 hours. So we have to do 16 milligrams times by 3 to give us a total dose of 48 milligrams. So that's the amount of rotigotine that the patient's going to be using over the 72-hour period. Obviously we wouldn't be giving a 16 milligram patch in reality. I just want to clarify this for the sake of argument. In the resource pack it talks about that you can only get a 2 milligram, 4 milligram, 6 milligram and 8 milligram patch. You can use them more than one patch at a time, but the maximum daily dose is 16 milligrams. So in reality the patient would actually use 2 8 mg patches every 24 hours. But the answer to the exam question obviously is that there. So the answer to this question is 10 milligrams. Oops, let's try that again. 10 milligrams. So let's take a look at the methodology behind how we can tackle this question. Please bear in mind, I'm just going to say this again, that these are theoretical, hypothetical questions. So I know that over here, so before people start messaging me, that an MR preparation of co-caraldopa is not recommended to be given 3 times a day. MR preparations are normally given once or twice a day, but this was taken from a past paper exam, and I left it exactly as it is for the case of this scenario for the calculation. So you just go with the flow for this one, for the purpose of doing the calculation for practice purposes. It's not a reality based scenario so much, it's more about practicing the calculation. So let's take a look at how we're going to tackle this question. So hopefully by now you're getting familiar with the way that I'm doing the 3-stage process. So I've got A, B, C and D. So I've written down my 4 stages, and my first stage is going to be my total levodopa daily calculation that I've got to do. The second stage is going to be my dopamine total daily dose of the dopamine agonist calculation I've got to do. C is going to be where I'm going to add A and B together, and I'm going to multiply it by 0.55. If at any point obviously you forget any of the stages of this process, don't worry, you can always look at the resource pack on the left here that they'll give you in the exam, and you can just obviously get all that information from there. So you're not expected to remember or learn a formula for this calculation, everything's given in the resource pack. But the reason I always train my students to learn this is because it just saves time in the exam, and also because it makes them more confident in the process that they're doing. So stage D is going to be where we get our answer from stage C, and we're going to divide it by 20 to get the number of milligrams of rotigotine in 24 hours. So hopefully you read the last stage of the exam question twice, this part down here. And when you read that twice, you understood that it wanted you to calculate the total strength of rotigotine patches in a 24-hour period that the patient's going to need in milligrams. So the good thing is, just by doing the calculation as it is in the resource pack, you'll get the answer in milligrams, and you'll get it for over 24 hours. So there's no need to do a further calculation at the end here, which is quite nice. So now let's jump into our calculation. So for the levodopa part of it, if we look up here where it mentions co-caraldopa, we can see it's a modified release preparation. There's 100 milligrams of levodopa in there, and the patient's taking 1-3 times a day. Well, if they're taking 1-3 times a day, we're going to do 3 times 100 milligrams to get us started, to calculate the total amount of levodopa. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, that's 300 milligrams. Now we need to multiply it by our factor. So in the resource pack over here, it tells us that if the patient's on an MR preparation, you times it by 0.7. However, it says, or if they're on a COMT inhibitor, you times it by 1.3. But if they're on an MR preparation and a COMT inhibitor, then you're just going to multiply it by 0.91. And in this scenario, our patient is on entacapone, which is a COMT inhibitor. And in this scenario, we've been given an MR preparation of levodopa. So we're going to use times 0.91. So it's very important that you understand the scenario you've been given in order to extract the right values. So 300 milligram on your calculator times 0.91 is going to give you an answer of 273 milligrams. Now we're going to do part B, our dopamine calculation. And for the dopamine calculation, we know that bromocriptine is our dopamine agonist over here, and the patient's taking 10 milligrams once a day. So that's their total dose is 10 milligrams because it's 1 tablet a day. And if you look at the resource pack, it tells you that if they're on bromocriptine for part B, you're going to times it by 10. That's your factor to calculate the equivalent dose. So it's 10 milligrams, which is what we took as their total amount they're taking a day here. And we're going to times that by a factor of 10, which is the number we got from the resource pack there. That gives you an answer of 100 milligrams. And remember, this is for the total daily dose. So it's very important that you look at the frequency that the patient's taking in the scenario you're given. Now in part C, we're going to add A and B together. So we're going to do 273 milligrams plus 100 milligrams. And we're going to times it by 0.55 on your calculator. That gives you an answer of 205.15 milligrams. Now that you've calculated that, you can move on to the fourth stage in the process, stage D, where you divide it by 20 to get your number of milligrams. So if I'm just going to scroll this up a bit, it's easier to write that way. If I do 205.15 divided by 20 on the calculator, that will give me an answer of 10.2575 milligrams. And just like in all the previous questions I've done on this video, you need to be aware that in the resource pack it states that Rotigotine, the dose, needs rounding to the nearest 2 milligrams. So rounding 10.2575 to the nearest 2 milligrams. Hopefully you're familiar with how I've been doing this. You're first going to write down what are the nearest 2 milligrams. So the nearest 2 milligrams are 12 milligrams and 10 milligrams. So what you say to yourself is, where does 10.2 lie? Well, the middle line between 10 and 12 is 11. That's your middle. So 10.2 lies over here, 10.2, between 10 and 11. So it's closer to 10. So you're going to round it down to 10 because it lies between 10 and 11. Any number lying between 10 and 11 is going to be rounded down to 10. Any number between 11 and 12, so if I had 11.4, 11.8, it would have been rounded up to 12. So in this scenario, 10.2 gets rounded down to 10 milligrams. Now, as the patient is taking 10 milligrams of Rotigotine, if you look at your question up here, it says calculate the total strength of Rotigotine patches. So 10 milligram is our total strength. Now, in reality, obviously in a community pharmacy setting, you would then have to supply this patient with 10 milligrams. So obviously the clinical practitioner, the person who's prescribing the prescription, would then decide whether to prescribe the patient an 8 milligram patch and a 2 milligram patch, or a 6 milligram patch and a 4 milligram patch. That would be their clinical decision when they're prescribing. But for the sake of the exam calculation here, you're interested in this here, the total amount of Rotigotine that they're taking in 24 hours. The answer to this question is 16 milligrams. Let's take a look at the methodology of how we got to this answer. So first of all, we write out our 4-stage process: A, B, C, D. What stage A? Where we calculate the total levodopa dose that the patient's taking a day. What stage B? We do the calculation for the dopamine total daily dose per day. What stage C? Where we add A and B together and we times it by 0.55. What stage D? Where we get our answer for stage C and we divide it by 20 to get the amount of milligrams that the patient's going to need in a 24-hour window. So straight away now we can look at the question up here and we can start extracting out the relevant parts that we need to answer the question. So first of all, hopefully you read through the question, you followed our 3-stage process that we do in our workbooks and our classes, and in stage 3 you make a note of what units that the answer has to be given in, so you double check that at the end. And let's go for the calculation. So the amount of levodopa that the patient's taking a day. Well, first of all, the patient's taking Stalevo, which is a combination product. In fact, what I'll do is I'll highlight it out for you to make it easier. So the levodopa is in green, and that's 150 milligrams there. So if the patient's taking 150 milligrams of levodopa, and it mentions he's taking one tablet 3 times a day, we're going to do 150 milligram times 3, which is 450 milligrams. Then we have to multiply it by if there's any other factors at play. So in the resource pack, it talks about that if it's an MR preparation, you're going to times it by 0.7. If they're on a COMT inhibitor, 1.3. And if they're on an MR and a COMT inhibitor, you'll use the 0.91 value. Well, in Stalevo, you've got entacapone combined in there, and entacapone is your COMT inhibitor, so your number's going to be 1.3. Stalevo is a standard release prep, so we use 1.3. If you do that on your calculator, it gives you an answer of 585 milligrams. Now let's look at our dopamine content. So inside there is no dopamine agonist. We've got levodopa, we've got carbidopa, and we've got entacapone. So that's quite straightforward. We can use a value of 0. Now we can do our calculation. So we can add A and B. So 585 milligrams plus 0 for our dopamine times by 0.55. And if you do that on your calculator, you get 321.75. Move on to stage 4, which is dividing your answer in stage C by 20. So we're going to do 321.75 divided by 20. That'll give us a number of milligrams of rotigotine in a 24-hour period. So if you do that on your calculator, you get 16.0875. And now we need to round that to the nearest 2 milligrams. And in all the previous questions, I've talked about rounding in this workbook to the nearest 2 milligrams. So let's just do it for the sake of it anyway. What are the nearest 2 2s to 16? Well, it's 18 and 16. So you've got to say to yourself, okay, where's my midpoint between 18 and 16? It's 17. That's the border between the two. So I have to decide now that when I've got 16.0, where does it fall closer to? Does it fall closer to the 17 or on the top? Well, it's on the bottom, isn't it? So we round to 16 because it's closer to the 16. So the answer to this question is 16 milligrams of rotigotine is going to be required. And the question is saying what would be a suitable daily dose in milligrams for Mr. K to use this alternative route of administration. So it's a 16 milligram. And you must also be aware that in the resource pack, like I talked about in the previous questions, that the maximum dose you can give of rotigotine is 16 milligrams. So if you had a calculation and it came higher than that, you would automatically default it down to 16 milligrams. The patches are only available in a 2 milligram, a 4 milligram, a 6 and an 8. So if the question asks you, for example, in this scenario, if the question said, how many 8 milligram patches should Mr. K be using in a 24-hour period, you would have to then obviously work out that 16 milligram is going to be used by 2 8 milligram patches, if that's what they're asking for in the question. So please be aware that you've read through this information in the resource pack and you familiarised yourself with it. Right, so the answer to this question is 16 milligrams. So let's take a look and tackle the question again using the same principles we've just been learning and using. So again, we're going to use our 4-stage process. So we're going to list down A, B, C and D. You should have isolated what the question was asking from you obviously at the very beginning. Should have followed your 3-stage process that we do in all our workbooks and classes. Once you've done your 3-stage process, list down your A, B, C, D. Be familiar with that. So we're doing our Levodopa total daily dose calculation first, followed by our dopamine agonist total daily dose calculation. In the third part, stage C, we're going to add A and B together, and then we're going to times it by 0.55. In stage D, we're going to take our answer from stage C and we're going to divide it by 20 to get the amount of milligrams of rotigotine that the patient needs in a 24-hour window. It's a very nice question because in the last part of the statement that we always read twice, it mentions it wants the number of milligrams in a 24-hour window. So that's quite nice. There's no multiplication of frequency that we have to do. So now, starting with our levodopa calculation, we can look up here and see that the patient's taking 250 milligrams of levodopa and they're taking 1 tablet 3 times a day. So that would be 250 milligrams times 3 to begin with, to give me an answer of 750 milligrams. Now I have to multiply this by my factor, if there is one. So when I look in box A over here, it's telling me that if the patient's on a modified release preparation, I must multiply it by 0.7. If they're on a COMT inhibitor, I must multiply it by 1.3. But if they're on an MR preparation and a COMT inhibitor, I multiply it by 0.91. So in this scenario, they're on entacapone, which is a COMT inhibitor, and they're on a standard release preparation. So I'm going to use 1.3 to multiply it by just a COMT. So 750 milligram times 1.3 on your calculator is going to give you an answer of 975 milligrams. Now I'll move on to stage 2, which is my dopamine agonist calculation. And this is the total amount that the patient's taking a day to begin with, 2 milligrams at 1 a day. So they're taking 2 milligrams daily. Now I'm going to multiply it by my factor to get the equivalent levodopa equivalent dose. So over here in this box, it's telling me that if the patient's on a particular type of dopamine agonist, I multiply it by a specific number. So for carbergoline, it's times 100 up here. So 2 milligrams times 100 on your calculator is going to give you an answer of 200 milligrams. Now that we've done that, we can move on to stage 3, which is C, which says add A to B and times it by 0.55. So you're going to do on your calculator 975 plus 200 times by 0.55. When you do that on your calculator, you get an answer of 646.25. That is your total amount of levodopa equivalent daily dose that the patient's taking. So I'm just going to, for the sake of it here, I'm going to write down here LEDD, and I'll explain why in a second because I want to talk to you about that. Let's just carry on with the calculation a second. So we've calculated 646.25 for our answer in C, and in the last stage of the process, stage D, we take our answer C and we divide it by 20 to get the amount of milligrams of rotigotine the patient will need in 24 hours. So we do 646.25 divided by 20 on our calculator. That gives us an answer of 32.3125 milligrams of rotigotine they're going to need in 24 hours. However, in the resource pack, it states that you need to be aware of this, that the maximum amount of rotigotine that you can be prescribed in any 24 hours is 16 milligrams. So you have to default this down to 16 milligrams because we don't want to overdose the patient. The licensed dose that we're recommended to use is 16 milligrams. It also mentions that when I talked about here in stage 3C that we calculated the levodopa daily dose, that if it's greater than 350 milligrams, use the rotigotine 16 milligram patch. So as it was 646 milligrams, it's greater than the 350. So again, it's telling you, look, reminding you, make sure you use the 16 milligram dose, which is what we had to do here. So in reality, we would be prescribing or dispensing to the patient. The physician will have picked 2 8 milligram patches. But for the sake of this question, we just want to know how many milligrams of rotigotine should the patient be using as an appropriate strength, which is 16 milligrams. Right, so I hope you found this introduction useful to give you a bit of an understanding of what the pharmacy masterclass in the calculation element actually involves. So do please log on to my website. It's www.pharmacymasterclass.com, and on the website you'll be able to gain again a bit of an understanding as to what it is that my training is all about. It's not about taking any shortcuts, it's not about wasting time or any crash courses. It's just about really, again, like it says on the website, it's targeted, it's focused, and it's proven teaching. So the current classes that I've got listed at this point in time, as of Wednesday the 28th of September 2022, is I've got the full health economics calculations masterclass, and that involves drug cost saving, it involves incremental cost effectiveness ratios, private prescription cost calculation training, medication synchronization training is included, and there's a whole host of other things like NNTs and NNH, number needed to treat, number needed to harm. So there's 80 past exam paper questions in there with 80 plus video tutorials to teach you the methodology behind that. The displacement volume 1 is what I talked about today, which has got 50 past paper exam questions in, plus 50 plus videos. And then there's the moles calculation masterclass training package that went up about a week ago, and that consists of 80 past paper exam questions and all the different types of questions that you might encounter to do in the category of moles, and it's got 80 plus training videos, which is absolutely amazing. There is currently still on offer the OTC full revision guide plus exam questions, and that's a physical copy that's posted out to you. And there will also be an online OTC quiz, revision quiz, coming soon on the website. Please keep an eye on the website, as there is much more to come. Hopefully over the coming year we'll be able to see classes for infusion rates, dilutions, concentrations, and much more. I'll also be including things like the BNF masterclasses, which will be chapter by chapter focused training, including past paper exam questions, MEP masterclass, and also some lifestyle classes on things like time management and productivity. Thank you for taking your time out to watch this video today. If you've got any questions, just drop me an email. It's available on my website. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. Share my website with your friends. You never know, it may benefit somebody out there.